Hello and welcome to Intercultural Studies. I'm Dr. Kalman Andrassy, and today we're going to be talking about communication and culture. So, communication is the basis of really all human contact. Okay? To understand a culture, we have to examine communication first. Um, And so ultimately, communication is the ability to share one's ideas and their feelings with another person. So that includes both the verbal as well as nonverbal symbols that people might utilize. And they might look or sound different, but the reasons they have for communicating are ultimately going to be relatively universal. Okay? So think of it this way: human communication is a dynamic process in which people are attempting to share their thoughts with other people through the use of symbols in very particular settings. Okay? So consider this. Think of the phrase communication is contextual. Now, context refers to the circumstances or the settings under which the communication is taking place. Can you think of examples of how context has influenced your behavior? Feel free to comment on that below. How have the circumstances and the setting influenced how you're communicating your ideas to other individuals? Okay. So now let's consider some of the uses of communication. Okay. Communication is very intricately tied to your personal identity. It defines in many ways who you are. It defines your loyalties. It defines where you belong, right? And so communication and personal perception are going to be intricately tied. Communication allows you to learn about other people, right? It assists you in how you describe yourself to other people, and conversely, how you come to understand how other people kind of describe themselves. Communication is also fundamental for interpersonal needs, right? Communication satisfies a very basic social need. It provides a sense of inclusion, a sense of affection, right? It also is fundamental to our ability to persuade individuals. Okay, so think about all of that, right? In order for you to be able to have other people see your point of view, you have to be able to communicate those ideas clearly. Okay, so personal experience reveals, what when you meet somebody for the first time, it allows you to gather information about that individual. And it provides you with a lot of information that really serves two purposes. It enables you to learn about the other person so that you can better understand the messages that they are producing, and it assists in deciding how to present yourself to that other person, right? If you were to learn that you were in the same room as the King of England, chances are you would probably behave a little bit differently than if you were in the same room as your best friend's cousin, right? Um, so it assists in allowing you to, again, present yourself to that other person. And so, in that sense, communication is going to be crucial to establishing your personal identity. Okay? So, as Woods notes, the self is not innate, but it is acquired in the process of communication with others. So, you have numerous identities. I mean, if you really sit down and think about it, this is the whole idea behind the philosophical and the social and sociological theory of dramaturgy. where you present yourself in different ways in different contexts to different people, right? You have a concept of yourself. You have your emotional ties to your family. You probably have certain attitudes towards individuals of other cultures, but also other genders and other demographic considerations. And chances are you have certain beliefs about your culture and perhaps, feelings of cultural superiority or perhaps even inferiority, depending on um, who you are. And again, the context under which you're thinking about those sorts of things. So, communication is going to allow you to send verbal and nonverbal messages that can shape, um, the behaviors that other people exhibit towards you. So you can kind of take advantage of that to some extent, right? How you present yourself and how you communicate your sense of self and who you are as an individual is probably going to influence how other people are going to react to you. So really, your ability to communicate gives you the ability to exercise a degree of control over your environment, right? So, think about situations in which your communication has allowed you to get what you want, right? Going to, a market and communicating with individuals about a product that you'd like to purchase. Getting yourself into a set of circumstances that perhaps aren't ideal, so you use communication to change the circumstances, change the frame of reference, and get you out of that circumstance, right? So, in that regard, communication is a very powerful tool. So, communication is ultimately going to be a very complex web of different elements that kind of come together. Okay. And this diagram here is going to help you kind of understand what's really going on in the communications process. Okay. So, let's start over here on the left with the concept of source. So the source is going to be a person that has some sort of an idea or a feeling or an experience that they want to share with another individual. Okay. The other person, the receiver, is going to be receiving the messages. That's over here on the right-hand side. Okay. Communication is an interactive process, right? To put it a little bit differently, while you're sending your messages to the other person, you're also receiving messages that are being generated by the person that you're communicating with, your communication partner, right? So, in generating your message, you encode that message. It's an internal activity, and it occurs when, as the source, you're creating a message through the selection of verbal or even nonverbal symbols. Okay. And although the process of converting feelings into words and actions is universal, the words and actions that you select and how they're strung together have their origins in the culture of the language that is being used. Okay. Um, Now moving on to this, contrasting that, with these nonverbal clues, right? You have different elements of the communication process other than just the words that you're using, right? The facial expressions that you use. If you're kind of looking like this as you're communicating your message, it might be scrutiny or perhaps even anger or something along those lines, right? Whether you're touching the other individual communicates certain messages. How you move your body, what your posture is. If you're sitting like this, as opposed to sitting like this, it is going to convey a different message, right? If you're trying to hide your face and things like that, that's going to be something that also potentially influences the communication, right? The level of eye contact that you make with the individual, whether you're making direct eye contact or averting your gaze. Again, that's going to be something that's culturally based. In some cultures, the expectation is that if you're communicating with somebody, you're going to have a high degree of eye contact. In other cultures, having direct eye contact with some individuals, especially individuals who are higher in the social hierarchy than you, your superiors, people who are older than you, it would be considered rude to make direct eye contact, right? And then different gestures that you make, um, in different contexts and different cultures, different different gestures mean completely different things. So whereas, this might mean peace or, be an expression of, you know, happiness in some cultures, it might take on a completely different connotation in other cultures, right? The United States has the thumbs up symbol. This can be a bad thing in some other cultures. The OK symbol can also have different meanings in different parts of the world. But let's get back here to these this web of communication, if you will. Okay, so the message then, the message is going to be the set of written or pictorial or verbal or nonverbal, as we saw in the next slide, symbols that represent the source's particular state of being at a very specific moment. So, while encoding is an internal act, the act of sending the message is going to be the external undertaking. It's going to be, you know, the subject matter to be communicated. Okay, which then opens us to the concept of the channel of communication, right here in the middle. So this channel, it can take a lot of different forms, in this context, as I am speaking with you, that is going to be a completely different channel of communication than if you're reading words in a book, right? The words on a printed page will constitute our message, and the actual printing on the pages is going to be the channel. Here with this communication, the channel of communication is a little bit more complicated, right? Because I'm utilizing YouTube as the channel of communication. So a social media network. And the message, of course, is going to be the verbal and to some extent the nonverbal cues that I'm giving in the context of having this little monologue here about all these different things. Okay, so things would be a little bit different if we were in a face-to-face setting, right? In a face-to-face sort of a context, sights and sounds are ultimately going to be the basis for the channel of communication, right? So again, in this context, we're using social media, and so the messages are being moved from place to place. I'm recording this right now in my home office. I might record future of these in my work office, and you're going to be looking at them in a variety of different places, whether in your own bedroom at home, on your cell phone, in various places at work, perhaps, or at school. So those messages can be conveyed in a lot of different places. Okay, so then that message ultimately gets communicated to the receiver. So in this case, if I am the source, the people watching this video would be the receivers. So ultimately, the receiver is the person that is taking the message into account and thereby is going to be directly linked to the source of the message. So the receivers might be those for whom the message is intended, in the case of everybody watching this for purposes of class or otherwise. You're the primary target, but perhaps there are individuals perhaps sitting behind you or in the same room or watching this along with you that maybe aren't the intended individuals to be contacted, but they are still individuals who are going to get into contact with the source's message, right? And then that leads to this process of decoding. So in decoding, the receiver is the person who is taking the message into account, and again is linked to the source and is going to be utilizing the message to potentially provide information back to the source or otherwise express the ways in which they're understanding the message that is being given. Okay? And with that comes the potential for a response, which becomes part of what we call a feedback loop. And feedback is essentially when you send a message to another person, You're going to get a response to that. Um, and that response might be in words, it might be nonverbal reactions, it might be silence. And silence can say a lot, right? Um, and it matters little, but what's important is that the message produce some sort of response that you take into account, right? So the perception of the response then is what we call the feedback. Sorry, the perception of the response to your message, I should say, is the feedback, right? And feedback typically has two stages. First, it applies to the direct reactions that individuals have and that you as the source obtain from your communication partner. And second, in most instances, you use that reaction to ultimately decide what to do next. And then perhaps you encode another message, send that through the channel of communication, that gets received, that gets decoded, and a response comes and another feedback goes back around. Okay? Around the channel of communication is this notion of noise. Okay, so noise is often thought of as interference with the communication process. So noise can either be external or it can be internal, and it influences your capacity to process the messages that you are receiving. Okay, so noise can be produced by, people sitting behind you and talking on a cell phone, by an air conditioner that's being too loud, a truck driving by, or again, it can be sort of an internal thing. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep the night before and you're really tired, or your attention is diverted, perhaps to your cell phone, perhaps, to something that has caught your attention, right? These are things that are going to potentially be influencing the messages that are being had. Okay, so because you can't necessarily directly access the internal thoughts of another person, you're going to have to rely and interpret their use of verbal and nonverbal symbols to represent those kinds of thoughts. Okay? So, as far as that is concerned, you have to keep a couple of things in mind. First and foremost, communication is a very dynamic process, right? It's ever changing. Um, words indicate that communication is an ongoing activity. It doesn't have a beginning. It doesn't have an end, right? And it's more like a motion picture than an individual snapshot. It's a complex, holistic product rather than a single slice in time. And so it's a dynamic process because once a word or an action is ultimately produced, it's something that cannot be retracted, right? Ending and receiving messages really involves a host of different variables, and they're all kind of in operation at the same time. And each of the parties to any type of communication transaction is reacting to the other by, seeing, listening, talking, thinking, and perhaps, engaging in different smiling or touching the other person. And all these things are kind of happening at the same time, all at once. So, you know, the symbols that you use in your communication, they are discretionary, they are subjective. There's no, innate connection between the symbols and their reference, and the relationships oftentimes are going to be arbitrary and usually shift from culture to culture. Different symbols in different cultures mean completely different things. So, in that sense, communication is also contextual, right? The context involves four main aspects, right? First, the number of people who are interacting. A one-on-one interaction is going to be completely different from you giving a speech to a large group of individuals, or, just you sitting down with a group of friends and having a group discussion, right? All those are going to be different dynamics that are going to shape the context under which you're going to be communicating the information and sending the messages across to the various receivers that are present. Okay. Of course, the environment is going to be another context. Where you are is going to influence what you're going to be talking about, for example, right? If you're at school, Usually the topics of discussion might be different than if you're at a dance club or a bar or something like that, right? The occasion is going to influence your communication, right? If you're casually meeting somebody on the street, that's different from going to their birthday party, different from going to their wedding, different from going to a party of some sort hosted at work. Versus a party that's thrown by your best friends, right? All those different occasions are going to influence the themes, the topics, and the way in which you ultimately communicate your ideas. Okay? Another thing that is influenced or influences, I should say, communication is the time, right? When you engage in a communicative action with somebody, it's going to influence the context of the clue as well, right? So even, I mean, if you think about it, even in terms of night and day, right? The way in which you interact with people in the daytime might be a little bit different from the way you interact with them at night, right? Um, an example of this in my own personal life, I remember distinctly, I was driving probably about 4 hours to get to a location at night. And, I hadn't eaten dinner, so I stopped by a fast food location. Probably it was midnight or 1 in the morning, and it was a 24-hour drive through. But taking my order and everything, I made sure to be extremely appreciative of the fact that they were working at 1 in the morning and providing me with service when most other people are asleep in their beds at home. So that is one example of how time can influence things, but also time in the context of the situation in which you're finding somebody in a position to be interacting with you. That's going to also affect the context. Okay. Another thing to consider is that communication is highly self-reflective, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the American philosopher, once said, wherever we go, whatever we do, self is the sole subject we study and learn, right? The focus of self can and usually does take place while you are communicating. And because of self-reflectiveness, you can think about the encounter that you're involved in while being an active member of that encounter, right? There's another very popular saying that the most popular subject of any conversation is yourself, right? People are themselves at all times, and as such, they know about themselves and they know their needs and their wants. And as such, a big part of the communication process is going to often be communicating those needs and those wants, and of course, those perspectives that you have. Something else that I kind of touched upon earlier, and I want to emphasize a little bit more, is the notion that communication is irreversible, right? A harsh word dropped from the tongue cannot be brought back by a coach and 6 horses, right? There's a phrase that is communication has consequences, right? What do you think is meant by that phrase, right? Again, I welcome any posts in the comments about that, right? Your communication is something that, once you've said something or once you've expressed an idea, it becomes really difficult to take it back. I mean, at best, sometimes you can convince somebody that the context or the chosen words were incorrectly chosen, but it's still probably going to influence the perception that the receiver has of you. So you have to be somewhat careful in choosing your words in engaging in communication. And the less careful you are, the more opportunities there are for misunderstandings or for you to come across as perhaps harsher or more negative than you otherwise would have wanted to express. Okay, so kind of finishing that all off, communication then is a really complex and complicated subject material, right? Communication is all about controlling, informing, persuading, and relating to others. So it has a lot of different functions. And it's, of course, going to be even more complex when a cultural dimension is added, right? And although all cultures use symbols to share their realities, the specific realities and the specific symbols that are going to be employed to share those ideas are oftentimes going to be quite different, right? In one culture, you might smile in a casual manner as a form of greeting, right? Um, in the United States, there is a culture of smiling and communicating and trying to be positive in your interactions with other individuals. And as somebody who has traveled throughout most of Europe, a lot of other cultures don't necessarily see smiling and being positive as being a true reflection of a person's uh, personal feelings and identity. And one of the big complaints that people have, or one of the big criticisms that they have of Americans traveling abroad, is that they come off as fake as a result of being positive, right? Um, as an American, for those of you who are not from an American background, I can tell you that it's not about being fake. Just culturally, we are taught to be and present the best form of ourselves, I think, in our communications. And a big part of that, then, of course, is smiling and having, or at least trying to align yourself with more positive aspects of your emotional presence, and as such, that's why Americans often come across as being perhaps excessively positive. Okay, and that then brings us to the notion of culture. Okay, um, Edward Hall famously said that culture is communication, and communication is culture. So culture ultimately is shared and has shared meanings. So you can think of culture as a set of human made objective and subjective elements that perhaps in the past had an increased probability of survival or resulted in satisfaction for the participants within some sort of an ecological niche, and thus kind of became shared among those who could communicate with each other because they had a common language and they lived in the same time and place, right? That's from Harry Triandis back in 1994. Okay. So culture serves a basic need by laying out a somewhat predictable world in which each individual is firmly grounded. Okay. It enables you to try to make some sense of your surroundings by offering a blueprint, by offering a core foundation in not only how you behave, but also what results you can anticipate from certain types of behavior. Okay. So each culture presents its members with ways of thinking and with ways of behaving. So, what are the functions of culture? Culture ultimately teaches people how to adapt to their surroundings, right? And it passes along previous knowledge and experiences to future generations. Okay. So let's think then about the elements of culture. What goes into a culture? What are the different aspects of cultures that are kind of universal? Okay, well, first and foremost is the concept of worldview. In a more scientific context, oftentimes worldview is referred to as a paradigm, Paradigm, a paradigm. And although every culture has a particular worldview, a more powerful worldview also pervades each culture and becomes a collective concept of reality. Okay? Another major element of culture is religion, right? So, religion, regardless of the form it takes, is used by people to help them understand the universe, natural phenomena, what to live and die for, perhaps, and how to dwell among other people, right? So we have lots of different formal religions. The big popular religions around the world are, of course, the Judeo-Christian and Islamic perspectives, the Abrahamic traditions. But then you also have Eastern religious philosophies like Hinduism and Buddhism, which are fairly large as well in terms of adherence. But also you have to factor in the idea of individuals that are rejecting traditional religious concepts, atheism, agnosticism, and perspectives like that, which can account for as much as about 20% of the population right now. So it's considered the fastest growing religious perspective out there. And, individuals that perhaps don't share in the religious perspectives of those around them might have different perspectives about the way the world operates. Okay? So, in addition to that, history is going to be a major contributor to culture as well. And all cultures believe in the idea that history provides, stories about the past that serve as lessons on how to live in the present, right? So you can learn from the past to make your life perhaps a little bit easier in our day-to-day interactions. Okay. Another element of culture is our values. Okay, you can take my ethics class and learn all about the notion of values in the context of ethics and moral behaviors and things like that. But as Garrick Bailey and James Peoples famously have said, values are a people's beliefs about their goals or ways of living that are desirable for themselves and their society. Right? Values have profound, though partly unconscious, effects on people's behaviors. So those are going to be all the different things that you take as part and parcel for how to achieve things in life and how to gain harmony and different positive outcomes within the context of your society. Okay. Another element of culture are the social organizations that exist. So these organizations, they're sometimes called social systems, they're sometimes called social structures. They represent, various social units within a culture, and they can be governmental structures, they can be educational institutions, they can be, marketplaces. There are lots of different social organizations and ways of grouping and interacting with individuals within the context of a society. Of course, language is a tremendous element of a culture, right? We all come to this world with all the biological and anatomical tools that are necessary for our survival, but we still have to learn some sort of a language in order to share our ideas, our feelings, and our thoughts with other people. And of course, language can be a barrier to our communication, right? Um, so in that context, there's generally a lingua franca in the world um, that tends to be the chosen language for business and other types of major, interactive communications. Right now, the English language is the lingua franca of the world, with it being the most learned language from individuals who are not native speakers. Prior to this, French was the lingua franca. That's why it's called lingua franca, franca referring to French. And it was sort of the language of diplomacy and international relations, as France was a tremendous player in the international sphere and responsible for a lot of the international organizations that were being developed in the 16 and the 1700s. Okay. So there's that. Okay. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of culture as well, right? So an important thing to note here is that culture is learned, right? It can be learned informally through interpersonal means and interpersonal communications. It can be taught formally through various social institutions, right? Teaching through proverb, right? There are sayings that are often popular in different types of cultures, right? Um, what comes immediately to mind here in English is one in the hand is worth two in the bush, which is the idea that it's better to actually have something and physically be in control of it than to have the potential between two of them in a location where perhaps you don't necessarily have control over it. In Hungarian, there's a famous saying, Bagoly mondja a verébnek, hogy nagy fejű, which basically means the owl tells the sparrow that he has a big head, right? And it's the idea that, an individual, needs to take into consideration their own identity and their own perceptions and their own perspective before coming to a judgment on others, right? Teaching through folk tales and legends and myths, right? Every country has its interesting stories about famous people in the past or what have you. Even the United States has stories like Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill and Johnny Appleseed, John Henry, um, all these mythical individuals that are conveying some sort of a virtue or a value, or perhaps are part of some sort of a cautionary tale about about the world, right? If you look at Disney animation studios, what do? They usually go and they identify world myths and legends, and they try to adapt that to a modern audience and convey stories about various virtues and value systems through these stories in an animated way, right? Uh, Culture could also be learned through art, right? And that includes, paintings and sculptures and things, but also music to a significant degree, right? And that kind of ties in with the next point, that learning culture can also happen through mass media, right? So you can learn a lot about Americans and the United States by looking at Hollywood films that come out and the kinds of music that's being produced. We um, one of the most popular genres of music today are rap and hip hop, which often talk about issues in urban settings and some of the social problems that exist um, in in the social world, and really, you know, all the different types of musical genres often hint at those sorts of things. In addition to, just describing and expressing different elements of how people see culture and the various types of relationships and interactions that they have with one another, right? Love songs, for example, are an expression of a particular type of relationship that we may have with other people. Okay. So another element of culture is that it is something that is passed along, right? So again, culture is based largely on symbols, and symbols are things that tie people together. So people package and store and transmit these symbols, you know, both verbally and non-verbally. Okay. In addition, culture is a very dynamic phenomenon as well, right? Cultures are subject to change. They're ever changing, right? Changes can be brought about by things like new technologies, right? Um, and changes today are really prolific if you really think about it, right? Um, in many ways, promoted by things like the rise of American capitalism in the United States. Um, the worldwide population is growing, and that's going to lead to changes in culture. Um, Large movement of immigrants is changing cultures, right? Food, I think, is a very important part of culture. And, when I was very little, as far as international food options were concerned, you know, for me, it was my mother cooking Hungarian food at home. And then, Everything that we're having from external sources are going to be American foods. And then, there was the occasional Italian restaurant or perhaps a Chinese restaurant. And then as I started to grow older, you started to see the emergence of other cultures beginning to take root in the United States. So you saw a rise in Thai restaurants and Vietnamese restaurants. Salvadorian food became available. Foods from all over the world. Ethiopian food became accessible where I was living in Los Angeles. Um, so Korean food and Korean barbecue really started to take root in the late 90s and early 2000s. Became really popular as well. So, again, that's another example of the proliferation of culture in large part due to the influence of immigrants. Okay. And of course, all of that is also due to the proliferation of information technology as well, right? You now have YouTube and Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and all these other different things where different cultural ideas are being showcased and as such um, become more available and part of the awareness of individuals in other cultures, right? The United States, in the past had been fairly good about transmitting its own um, perspectives and things through its media, like Hollywood and things like that, which has pervaded many parts of the world. Um, but now with the kind of democratization, if you will, of social media, people from all over the world can share their ideas and their perspectives, and now that's starting to permeate places like the United States that perhaps at one point had been uh, a culture in sharing and in pop culture and things like that. But now, what are some of the most popular television shows in the United States? Korean dramas and Japanese anime and things like that. So, again, we're seeing a significant change in some of those cultural dynamics because of information technology. Okay. So, in addition to that, culture is going to be deeply rooted in tradition, right? Culture is a very conservative sort of a concept. Um, Cultures seek to endure, they want to persist, they want to keep on existing. And so the deep structure of a culture is going to resist major alterations, right? Popular culture may be a little bit more open to change, but things like values and beliefs, the idea of the role of government, basic ethics, morals, religious practices, those are going to be things that generally persist from generation to generation, right? Um, I guess the last major thing is that if you really think about it, culture is a very integrated system, right? All parts of a culture are interconnected, right? Paul famously said, you touch a culture in one place and everything else is affected, right? So values can influence things about all aspects of life, from family size to a person's work ethic, um, to their use and understanding of time, to their spiritual pursuits, right? And of course, changes in technology can change certain cultural values, attitudes, and behaviors as people are exposed to alternative ideas and different perspectives to come to understand the world around. Okay, so to kind of recap here, communication is culture, and culture is communication, right? And there are lots of elements to the communication process. There's a whole big web that's involved with that. But ultimately, that is how culture is going to be expressed, both through verbal and nonverbal symbols and the communication of ideas from one generation to the next, and far more so today, the communication of ideas using things like information technologies and in this case, social media today to convey a lot of ideas and potentially change perspectives. Okay, so um, that is about it as this concept. So I hope that everybody has a fantastic day, and hopefully you're beginning to come to a good understanding about culture and the way in which it's transmitted. And that's going to be the topic of our next discussion, which is going to be all about the family and the deep structure of culture and communication.